In this detailed example, we're going to look at how to create graphs in Excel, and we're going to use the random sample of 20 cases from the 2012 General Social Survey. So suppose that we wanted to create 3 different graphs for the variables race, class, and education. So the first thing we can do is we can hide all of those variables that we're not interested in using in the analysis. So remember from our earlier detailed example that if you click in the heading of the variable and then you click and hold down the control key, you can select any variables other than the ones that you want to use. And then if you right click someplace in the heading, one of the options is to hide the variables that you don't want to use. Okay, now that we've hidden those variables, let's suppose that we wanted to make a graph for the variable race. Well, because it's a nominal variable, we really have the choice of 2 different graphs, either a pie chart or a bar graph. And so either one we choose is acceptable. Let's say that we wanted to make a pie chart for race. The first thing that we would have to do is we would have to make a frequency distribution of race. We could also use a percent distribution. Now, although we did this by hand in an earlier detailed example, it's actually the case that Excel has a built-in routine for creating frequency distributions. It's something called a pivot table. And so if you go to the Insert menu and you go to Pivot Table, this is what Excel uses to create frequency tables. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to tell Excel what range the data are in. And that's already entered here because I've already selected the values of the variable race before I clicked on the pivot table. So this comes up automatically. But if it doesn't, you could just select them now. The next thing I have to do is I have to tell Excel where to put my table. And so I could either put it in a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. And I think I'm going to put it in an existing worksheet. And I just have to tell Excel where I want to put it. So I have to put in some kind of a location. And so I'm going to put my table right here. And so going back to this, if I click OK, Excel will bring up some further things that I have to do to create my table. And so if I scroll over to the other side of the screen, notice that we have some new things here. So first of all, we have to take our variable and we have to move it over where it says row labels. That will create a different label for each of the distinct categories of the variable. But we're not quite done yet. We still need their frequency tables. And so if we go back to that part on the table, located on the other side of the screen, we have to fill in one more column. And basically we have to take our race and we have to move it down where it says sigma values. Now that'll create some values here that give us the sum of race. Well, that's not exactly what we want. And so again, if we go back and we go back to where it says values down here, we have to change one of the defaults. We have to go to where it says field value settings. And we have to change this from sum to count. And so we're going to change that to count and click OK. And now what we have is a frequency distribution. And so you can see that 14 people are in category 1, 5 people are in category 2, and 1 person in category 3 for a total of 20. And so this is the right frequency distribution. Now at this point we can actually change some of these values. And so category 1 turns out to be white for the variable race, black is 2, and 3 is other. And so now we're ready to actually create our pie chart. And all we have to do basically is highlight these values. And when we do that, now we can create a graph. And so if we go up here, again to the Insert menu, one of the choices is a pie chart. And so we're going to click on just a basic 2-dimensional pie chart. And notice that Excel generates a pie chart. Now there's several different options that we have for making this pie chart. So let's take a look at a couple of them. So first of all, if we click someplace within the series, make sure that all the series are selected. And then right-click to add data labels. And so notice that Excel put in the frequency distribution in our pie chart. And so we see that 1 person is other, 5 are black, and 14 are white. We can actually change these a bit. There's several different options here. And so we can format the data labels. For example, we can put in percentages rather than values by clicking the proper check buttons here. We can also add the category names if we want to. And then we can change the position. We can center them, or we can put them outside, or we can put them inside. It doesn't really matter because they're movable. And so if we click close, now we can manipulate some of the other features of the pie chart. So for example, we don't really need a legend anymore because all the category labels are already there. One thing we could do is we can change this to have some kind of a title. And so let's call this Figure 1 Pie Chart of Race. And then we just need to add some kind of a text box, including the source and the total number of cases that we use. And so again, if you go up to the Insert pull-down menu and select Text Box, you can click someplace in here and it'll make the text box for you. And you just type in source GSS 2012, and then our total number of cases, which is 20. And we can just basically resize this a little bit. And we have a pretty good looking pie chart. And so you can see here that the basic pattern is that most people are white. The majority, 70%. About a quarter are black, and the remaining 5% are in an other category. So I'm going to advance this presentation forward just a little bit, and we'll take a look next how to make a bar graph of class using an already generated pivot table. Okay, so moving forward a little bit, I've now created a pivot table for class, and notice we have the frequency distribution of class. And so we can basically just label each of these different categories. So category 1 for class is the lower class. Category 2 is the working class. Category 3 is the middle class. And category 4 is the upper class. And so in order to make a bar graph for this variable, all I have to do is I have to highlight the categories and their frequencies. And if I go up here to where it says Insert, notice that one of the things I can insert is a bar graph. And so I'm just going to hit the simple bar graph. And Excel will automatically create a bar graph for my variable. And so notice that the height of the bars is proportional to the number of cases in each category, the frequency. And so I have one person who's lower class, 10 people who are working class, 8 people who are middle class, and then of course one person who's upper class. Now we can do several things to alter the appearance of this bar chart to make it look a little bit better. For one thing, we don't really need a legend, so if we just highlight that and hit delete, we can eliminate that. The other thing is we can change this text box in order to put our title. So let's make this Figure 2 bar graph of social class. Oops. Okay. And we can do a variety of things with this. We can move it over if we wanted to. It's completely movable. It's very easy to change. The other thing we want to do is we want to label our axes and put in our source information. And so if we just click someplace within the graph and select the entire graph area, that'll enable us to move it up a little bit and to move it a little bit to the right. And so now what we can do is we can just go to Insert and Text Box and put in a text box someplace. And so here's our text box, and we can basically label our axes. We can call one social class. We can make this just a little bit better fitting. Put that right here. We can put in other text boxes. Sometimes I just like to copy and paste the text box instead of making a new one and just editing this one. So we'll call this frequency. And then if we use this little green thing, you can actually rotate this. It looks pretty good. And then we can just make one more text box for our source information and our total number of cases. So our source in this case, again, is the General Social Survey 2012, and we have a total of 20 cases. And so looking at this graph, what is the basic pattern that we notice? Well, we see that most people consider themselves to be either working class or middle class. and then a far smaller proportion consider themselves to be in the lower or the upper class. And so we can basically say that most people are in the middle when it comes to their subjective or perceived social class. Advancing this presentation forward yet again, this time notice that now I've created a pivot table for education. And so here we have, for each of the categories, the number of cases or the frequency of each of the categories. And what I've done here is I've created a bar chart for education. And so notice that I have some kind of a title. I've labeled my axes as frequency or education in years. I also have a source and a total number of cases. Now, the problem with this chart is that education really isn't measured as discrete units as it's shown here. It's measured on a continuum. And so we really don't want the space in between the different bars. And so what we could do here is we could edit this graph a little bit to make it look more like a histogram, which is really the appropriate chart to use with an interval ratio variable like education. And so how do we take this bar graph and make it look more like a histogram? Well, if you just click the bars and then you right-click it, you have the option of changing the data series, formatting the data series. And so one of the options that you can change is the gap width. And so you should take this gap width and make it equal to 0 by sliding this all the way over to where it says no gap. And so if we close, we see now that we have contiguous bars that are touching, indicating that this measure is measured on a continuous scale. And so looking at the basic pattern in this graph, we can see that there's some peaks here at 12 years of education and 17 years of education. We see that consistent with our pivot table, 5 people have 12 years of education. We have 4 people with 17 years of education. The overall pattern seems to be that there's more people at the left tail of the distribution than at the right tail of the distribution. And the data have quite a wide span from 10 years of education all the way to 19 years of education. Now, in terms of the options for graphing this variable, I could have used percentages rather than frequencies. It really doesn't matter in this case because I would get the same basic picture. I would just have to change the axis if this was a percent, and I would have to indicate percent here rather than frequency. I could have also used a line graph rather than a histogram, and so it's actually very easy to switch between the two. Let's say that I wanted to use a line graph instead of this histogram. Well, I would just right-click somewhere inside the graph area, and I would go to change chart type, and so I could change it to a line graph, and I would get the same basic picture. And so this would make it easier if I wanted to, for example, add another series to my graph to show a different picture. And so either way, I see the same basic thing. I see that I have, again, a peak at 12 years of education, another peak at 17 years of education. There's a slightly larger proportion of people at the kind of the lower end of education at the upper end. And we see the same basic range. So either one of these is appropriate. Of course, I would have to change my title here to indicate that this is a line graph or a frequency polygon. But either one is acceptable for this particular variable.